Today's lesson is entitled, The Making of a Nation. We will continue the story of God's amazing grace in providing a way for man to have fellowship with God. Our 3 points will include God delivers his people, number 2, the covenant established, and number 3, Israel's inheritance affirmed and realized. Our central truth, God established his covenant with the people of Israel, and we consider God's faithfulness to his covenant people, and we trust him. God, through Israel, brought to mankind Jesus Christ, the Savior of the world. Golden text today is found in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 7, verse 7. The Lord did not set his love on you, nor choose you, because you were more in number than any of the peoples, for you were the fewest of all peoples, but because the Lord loved you and kept the oath which he swore to your fathers, the Lord brought you out by a mighty hand and redeemed you from the house of slavery, from the hand of Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. In our introduction today, the last verse in the book of Genesis, which is the book of beginnings, reads like this. Joseph died at the age of 110 years, and he was embalmed and placed in a coffin in Egypt. In looking at the forefathers and the ages that they lived, Abraham lived to be 175, Isaac died at 180, Jacob lived to be 147 years old. He was 77 when he stole Esau's blessing and he had to leave home and go to relatives up north. Within the first 14 years of his marriage, there were 11 sons and 1 daughter that was born to him. This is all recorded in the book of Genesis. Joseph was his favorite son, and later Benjamin was also born, but Rachel died in childbirth when he was born. And so the story began with the creation of the heavens and the earth, and it ended with a coffin in Egypt. So begins the story of redemption. There were famine conditions in the land of promise where Abraham was. And so his family members traveled. There were 70 of them that traveled to Egypt, where there was plenty of food. Joseph was there, and he had made provision for not only the people of Israel, but would also include Abraham's family. There were 70 of them that traveled to begin with, and when they came out of Egypt, they were over 600,000 people. They began the trek to the new country, and it was very difficult until they finally were expelled from the land of Egypt. A new dynasty arose who did not know Joseph, and the people of Israel were enslaved. They were forced to work hard, and a lot of taxes were extracted from them. The reasoning for the Pharaoh was that the people of Israel were more and mightier than the Egyptians, and they might even try to take over the nation. It would be Pharaoh's daughter who brought up Moses. Pharaoh brought up and educated and prepared the very man that did what he feared. For Moses was the man that would lead the people of Israel out of Egyptian bondage. Moses was used by God, and he was one of the greatest men of all times. We read about him today, and we still have a deep appreciation for a man who walked with God. He even had fellowship with God, and at times God spoke to him. Joseph lived to see his great-grandchildren, and when he realized that he was near death, he said to his brethren, I'm going to die, but God will eventually lead you out of Egypt, and when he does, I want you to carry my bones with you to the promised land. And so the book of Genesis is the foundation on which all of divine revelation rests and on which it is built. Genesis, the book of beginnings. Every great doctrine in the old Bible, in the scripture, has its roots in Genesis, whether it's in type or whether it's in Revelation. And so to understand the Bible, we have to get a good foundation and a correct understanding of what the origin was with the calling of Abraham. We come to point 1 of today's lesson, which is entitled, God Delivers His People. We'll be in the book of Exodus in chapter 3 and in chapter 12. Our subtopic is God's call to Moses. We're in Exodus 3, first 10 verses.
And the Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and have given heed to their cry because of their taskmasters. For I am aware of their sufferings. So I have come down to deliver them from the power of the Egyptians, and to bring them up from that land to a good and spacious land, to a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanite, and the Hittite, and the Amorite, and the Perizzite, and the Hivite, and the Jebusite. And now, behold, the cry of the sons of Israel has come to me furthermore. I have seen the oppression with which the Egyptians are oppressing them. Therefore, come now, and I will send you to Pharaoh, so that you may bring my people, the sons of Israel, out of Egypt. Question. Exodus 3 describes a theophany. What exactly is a theophany?
In Arabia, where they depend on their livelihood was from the animals, the sheep, the cattle, even the donkeys were very important back in those days. And there was not a lot of vegetation where there were a great number of those animals that were being provided food. And so a lot of times the shepherds would have to leave the area with which they're familiar, where their tents were located, and go long distances so that they could find better pastures. At times they were gone for weeks, and sometimes even months trying to find new pastures. So when Moses was leaving the land of Egypt, because you know the story of how he killed men and it was necessary for his life to be spared, he had to leave. And he made his way into the part of the country where he became a shepherd. This man, Moses, had all of the benefits of the Pharaoh of Egypt. He knew all about the ways of fighting. He knew about all of the education. It was all provided by the Pharaoh. And when he killed the men and had to leave, he had to become a shepherd, and he helped to watch his father-in-law's flock. So whenever all of the pasture land that he was accustomed to using for the animals was depleted, he would have to go on long journeys just to be able to find food. One day he was gone quite a ways from home. We don't know how long he had been gone, but sometimes they had to leave for weeks at a time. But there was something that attracted his attention on this particular time when he was away from home with the pastoring of his flock. And he looked in the distance. He saw a very strange sight. He wanted to go a little bit closer to see if he could understand what was going on, because he saw fire. In that area of the country, fire could have been quite hazardous and would have destroyed even more pasture land. The closer he got to where the fire was, he saw that a bush was on fire, but the bush was not being consumed. While he got a little bit closer, he heard the voice of the Lord speak to him. And he said, "Moses, put off your shoes, because the ground where you're standing is holy ground." This is a totally new experience for this man. I'm sure that he had heard about God from his own mother, the Jewish mother, who cared for him for the first few years of his life. But when he was in Egypt, Egypt was known for their great host of different gods. Everything was a god. There's a little beetle called a scarab. Sometimes you might look in the jewelry store and you'll find the scarab depicted in a pin that ladies wear on their garments. The scarab was very interesting. It would lay eggs a long distance from water, and then with its back legs, it would roll those eggs to the nearest water. That was just one of hundreds of gods in the land of Egypt. So when God begins to speak to Moses, they are now in the presence of Almighty God, Moses and his flock, and he hears the voice of God for the first time that we have record of. And God begins to speak to him in a very special way. It's interesting that even back in those days, the Orientals were careful to remove their shoes before they entered a house. You just didn't wear your shoes in the house. You wore shoes outside, but when you got inside, you went barefooted. Anywhere they were, that was a place of worship or a place of distinction. They would remove their shoes like we remove our hats. In this way, when Moses removed his shoes, he's showing his reverence for the divine presence at the burning bush. When Joshua met the captain of the Lord's host near Jericho, he was also required to remove his shoes in the 5th chapter of the book of Joshua. So in answer to the question,
Exodus 3 describes a theophany. What exactly is a theophany?
a theophany is a visible encounter with God. And we come to the subtopic B, God reveals the divine name from Exodus chapter 3.
Then Moses said to God, "Behold, I am going to the sons of Israel, and I shall say to them, The God of your fathers has sent me to you. Now they may say to me, What is his name? What shall I say to them?" And God said to Moses, "I am who I am." And he said, "Thus you shall say to the sons of Israel, I am has sent me to you." And God furthermore said to Moses, "Thus you shall say to the sons of Israel, The Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob has sent me to you. This is my name forever, and this is my memorial name to all generations." Question: why is I am who I am such a powerful name?
After Moses had his encounter with God, he discovered the reason for this encounter was that God called him to bring Israel out of Egypt. You have to remember that Moses fled from Egypt because he had killed a man. To think that he would go back and bring Israel out of Egypt was an overwhelming thought to him. And so, as he begins to speak with God and he realizes this is a very unusual encounter, he says, I know that the Egyptians have a name for all of their gods. I know that if I come to them and tell them that God has sent me to bring them out of Egypt, they're going to ask the question, what is his name? And so he said to God, I need to know your name. Now this is the God that we called Jehovah or Yahweh, which means Lord. He is also Elohim, which means God. And he wanted to know the name of God. It was unknown. It was unknown in a lot of places of Israel even. And when Moses finished talking with the Lord, he realized that this was a very, very unusual encounter. God reminded Moses that he was the God of Moses' father. He was the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. And Moses belonged to the sons of Israel, even though he had been raised or reared in the palace of Egypt. God was aware of the suffering that the people of Israel were going through. The nation had expanded to over 600,000 people. It was time for them to leave the land where they were birthed as a nation. While they were in Egypt, they learned a lot. They learned the skills of building, they learned farming, and they even learned politics. But God says, it's time, it's time. And so he called with a divine call the man Moses, whom he had been preparing for all of these years, to be the one who would lead the people of Israel out of Egypt. There were a lot of plagues before Egypt finally allowed them to go, but by the end of the plagues, all of Egypt knew the name of the God of Abraham. He makes himself known to Moses, and Moses in turn makes himself known to the family of Abraham, and then brings them out of Egypt to the promised land. So the answer to the question,
why is I am who I am such a powerful name?
God's Hebrew name is Yahweh. In the older versions of the scriptures, the name is Jehovah. That divine name signifies that God is the self-sufficient one. He is the self-existing one. The gods of Egypt were supposed to have emerged from the swamps of the Nile River. But Yahweh is eternally self-contained. Before there was time and space and light and darkness, even the earth and the heavens, there was Yahweh. We are so blessed to have known about him all of our lives. But when we go back to the origin, the beginning of Genesis, and we realize how he has had such an impact on our generation. Even today, we have to stand in awe of the greatness of God. Subpoint C of today's lesson is the Passover, a new beginning. We go to Exodus chapter 12.
For the Lord will pass through to smite the Egyptians, and when he sees the blood on the lintel and on the 2 doorposts, the Lord will pass over the door and will not allow the destroyer to come into your house to smite you. And you shall observe this event as an ordinance for you and your children forever. And it will come about when you enter the land which the Lord will give you, as he has promised, that you shall observe this rite. And it will come about when your children will say to you, what does this rite mean to you? That you shall say, it is a Passover sacrifice to the Lord, who passed over the houses of the sons of Israel in Egypt, when he smote the Egyptians, but spared our homes. And the people bowed low and worshipped. Then all the sons of Israel did so. They did just as the Lord had commanded Moses and Aaron. And it came about on that same day that the Lord brought the sons of Israel out of the land of Egypt by their hosts. Question: what was the significance of the blood on the doorposts?
Remember when Egypt was no longer the slave master over Israel, and Israel were allowed to leave that land with the mighty hand of God. They were asked to have a very special kind of food in a very special place, which was called the Passover. The Passover signified a new beginning for the people of Israel. And in Egypt, those who applied the blood to the doorpost were also passed over, as the Israelis were, who had the blood on their doorpost. But for the most part, Egypt suffered a lot of death because they did not respond to the information that the blood on the doorpost would be a sign that the death angel would pass over. It seems to me that from the very earliest of these verses that Heather just read out of Egypt, Exodus chapter 12, that the angel himself had a destroyer, and the angel would come by, and if there was no blood on the doorpost, then the destroyer would be the one who would smite the firstborn in that household. It seemed that this was to be carried on not only for just one time, but for the rest of history. It was the Lord's Passover. It seems that Jehovah passed over Egypt and directed all of this that was going on at this particular time. The Passover anticipated the salvation of the Gentiles, and it was more than just a historic event. It was that which liberated their ancestors, an annual enactment celebrating the liberation of future generations as well. And in the New Testament, Paul refers back to this occasion when he says in 1 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 7, Christ, indeed Christ, our Passover, was sacrificed for us. And just before he was crucified, Jesus took the bread and blessed it and broke it and gave it to them, and he said, take, eat, this is my body. And he took the cup, and when he had given thanks, he gave it to them, and he said, this is my blood of the new covenant, which is shed for many. So Christians gather together in the name of the Lord, and we remember the sacrificial death of Jesus Christ. We remember through the Lord's Supper when we take of the tiny bit of bread and we drink a little tiny cup of juice to remember the death, the sacrificial death of the Lord. To remember Christ's death through the Lord's Supper is to participate in the event. And the answer to the question,
what was the significance of the blood on the doorposts?
the blood on the doorpost signified deliverance and life for the children of Israel. Point 2 of today's lesson, the covenant is established, and we will be in Exodus 19 and Deuteronomy 7. Subtopic A of point 2 is the kingdom of priests.
In the 3rd month after the sons of Israel had gone out of the land of Egypt, on that very day they came into the wilderness of Sinai. When they set out from Rephidim, they came to the wilderness of Sinai and camped in the wilderness. And there Israel camped in front of the mountain. And Moses went up to God, and the Lord called to him from the mountain, saying, Thus you shall say to the house of Jacob, and tell the sons of Israel, You yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I bore you on eagle's wings, and brought you to myself. Now then, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, then you shall be my own possession among all the peoples, for all the earth is mine, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. There are the words that you shall speak to the sons of Israel. So Moses came and called the elders of the people, and set before them all these words which the Lord had commanded him. And all the people answered together and said, All that the Lord has spoken, we will do. And Moses brought back the words of the people of the Lord. Question: how is 1 Peter 2:9 and Exodus 19:5 similar in content?
We're skipping a lot of the history of the leaving from Egypt of the people of Israel. And we do know that they had to cross the Red Sea, and the sea parted, and they were able to go across on dry land. All of this is very interesting, important, and absolutely phenomenal. 3 months after the nation of Israel left Egypt, they came to the wilderness of Sinai. That was desert land. This desert in front of Mount Sinai was approximately 2 miles long and a half mile wide. It is nearly flat and could easily accommodate the nearly 3 million Israelites who would gather here. The Feast of the Passover personally saw Israel's departure from Egypt, and now 50 days later, they will be coming to the Feast of Pentecost. Moses was called to the mountain where he again had a conversation with God, and he was given the responsibility of relaying what God had said to him to his own people. The content of the covenant is kind and gracious, and it gives the Israelis absolutely the greatest privileges and advantages. God reminds them of what he's done for them, how he bore them on eagle wings. Absolutely phenomenal when you think that there are that many people that came out of the land of Egypt and traveled to this place where Mount Sinai is located. Absolutely phenomenal. And it could have only happened by the great hand of God. Sometimes when you and I are in this life, we come up against difficulties that we do not understand. We can mope about it, we can look around, and we can wonder why this is happening to us. But we have to know that through this life we're going to have trials and tribulations and tests. We also have to know that God's hand that has been with us on our journey will also carry us through whatever difficulty we are now encountering. Just remember, when you read about the account of these hosts of people that have come through so much, have been through so much, but they have seen the hand of God. And God said it was like he carried them on wings. He was right there with them. He was there. Egypt was the nest where they were hatched. And when they reached maturity, they were carried out of that nest. They were being saved by him. And now he insisted that they should be ruled by him. They said, all that the Lord has spoken we will do. So Moses delivered their answer to the Lord. This is a quote from JSM. Man has ever proclaimed his ability to obey God and has ever portrayed his constant failure. Had they known their own hearts, they would have replied that such a condition was impossible to them, and they would have cast themselves upon God and prayed that he would give them new hearts capable of such an obedience. This would no doubt have been granted. So the answer to the question,
how was 1 Peter 2:9 and Exodus 19:5 similar in content?
in Exodus chapter 19 and verse 5, there are two conditions of blessing for the family of Abraham. Number one, he said, if you will obey my voice. And number two, if you will keep my covenant. 3 blessings are promised if these conditions are met. You shall be a peculiar treasure to me above all peoples on the earth. And number 2, you shall be a kingdom of priests to all other nations. And number 3, you shall be a holy nation. Then we go to the New Testament in 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 9. And we have what believers are to God. And he says, but you are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a peculiar people, that you should show forth the praises of him who has called you out of darkness into his marvelous light, which in time past were not a people, but are now the people of God, which had not obtained mercy, but now have obtained mercy. When we read the Old Testament account of how the people of Israel were delivered, and we go to the second 1 Peter chapter 2, we have to understand that God has the church in his care as he had the people of Israel in the Old Testament. We come to subtopic B, which is a chosen people, and we're in Deuteronomy chapter 7.
For you are a holy people to the Lord your God. The Lord your God has chosen you to be a people for his own possession out of all the peoples who are on the face of the earth. The Lord did not set his love on you nor choose you because you were more in number than any of the other peoples, for you were the fewest of all peoples, but because the Lord loved you and kept the oath which he swore to your forefathers, the Lord brought you out by a mighty hand and redeemed you from the house of slavery, from the hand of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. Question: how did God show the Israelites that they were his chosen people?
In the book of Deuteronomy, Moses is giving his farewell address to his people. Because of one mistake that he made, he was not allowed to enter into the promised land. And so, in the passage that Heather just read, he showed us that the Lord God had chosen the people of Israel And it was not because they were a great nation, a mighty nation. It was not because they were a wealthy nation, but it was because of his great love that he had for the people ever since Abraham was called out as his own. Moses is giving last-minute instructions, and he says they must continue their separation to God. They must not compromise with the people of the land. They must not marry the people of the land which they're going, because they would probably adhere to the god of their new wife. They were to sweep out all the signs of false religion, the altars, the pillars, and the Asherah. By the way, Asherah was the wife of Baal. And they were to get rid of all the graven images. And Moses warned the people that God would be as faithful to them as they were to him. And he warned them that there was a lot of work ahead of them. When they saw what was ahead, when they crossed into the promised land, he did not want them to dwell on those things. If they dwelt on those hardships that they were about to face, it would be like the time when their fathers were about to enter into the land of promise, but the 12 spies brought back a bad report, and they just went back to the wilderness. Moses urged his people to constantly remember their victories. There were 2 reasons why God chose Israel. He loved them, and he has the ability to keep his oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So the answer to the question,
how did God show the Israelites that they were his chosen people?
Israel was not a mighty nation or a wealthy nation. They were slaves, the least of all people. But God set his love on them and transformed them from a nation of slaves into a nation of royal priesthood. Abraham's descendants were to be the priests that would to show the world the greatness of Yahweh, their God. We come to point 3, which is Israel's inheritance affirmed and realized. And in the book of Joshua, point A, we are discussing the inheriting the promised land. Joshua chapter 1.
Now it came about after the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord, that the Lord spoke to Joshua, the son of Nun, Moses' servant, saying, Moses my servant is dead. Now therefore arise, cross this Jordan, you and all this people, to the land which I am giving to them, to the sons of Israel. Every place on which the sole of your foot treads, I have given it to you, just as I spoke to Moses. No man will be able to stand before you all the days of your life. Just as I have been with Moses, I will be with you. I will not fail you or forsake you. Be strong and courageous, for you shall give this people possession of the land which I swore to their fathers to give them. Question: what were the 2 responsibilities given to Joshua after Moses' death?
Joshua is now old. He has led the people all the way from the land where they settled around Mount Sinai into the promised land. They have fought many battles. They have won many battles. The land has been distributed among the 12 tribes. They still have a lot of work to do, but it's Joshua's time now to talk to the people for the last time. And as he speaks to them, he relates again the story of their conquest of the land and how God was with them In verse 2 of chapter 1, he speaks, Moses, my servant, is dead. Now, therefore, arise and cross this Jordan. This was God's call to Joshua. So the connecting word between this book and the book of Deuteronomy is the use of the word therefore. He calls him to move forward. He calls him to a great responsibility. He calls him with a divine commission. And he promised that he would go forward with victory because God had given this land to the people. There were already people that lived there, but this is God's land, and it has been specifically designated for the people of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. There were two conditions that Joshua was given as commands, and they were he must be strong and he must be obedient and courageous. He is courageous and obedient. We put those two together to the voice of the Lord. Without wasting any time, Joshua calls the people he was to lead, and he calls them with a plan to move ahead. Within 3 days, when they are on the outer banks of the river, the 3 days they were to move forward toward all the conflict and the difficulty that had long ago frightened their fathers. They obeyed the Lord and they began the journey. The people answered the call of their new leader, and they said, "We will follow you, Joshua. Only be strong and be courageous and go with God, just as Moses did." They were making the same demand on Joshua that Jehovah had already made. So the promised land was given as an everlasting possession to the descendants of the people of Israel forever. And the answer to the question,
What were the two responsibilities given to Joshua after Moses' death?
the two primary responsibilities of Joshua were these. He was to be Israel's military leader to conquer Canaan and to administrate the allotment of the land to the tribes of Israel. And point B, subtopic B in our point 3 is we remember the covenant. And again, we are listening to the words of Joshua in his final tribute to the people of Israel before he himself succumbs to death, and they are left without either Moses or himself. Chapter 24.
Then Joshua gathered all the tribes of Israel to Shechem, and called for the elders of Israel and for their heads and their judges and their officers, and they presented themselves before God. And I gave you a land on which you had not labored, and cities which you had not built, and you have lived in them. You are eating of the vineyards and olive groves which you did not plant. Now therefore, fear the Lord and serve him in sincerity and truth, and put away the gods which your fathers served beyond the river and in Egypt, and serve the Lord. And if it is disagreeable in your sight to serve the Lord, choose for yourselves today whom you will serve, whether the gods which your fathers served, which were beyond the rivers, or the gods of the Amorites, in whose land you are living. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. Question: how does Joshua teach his people about a divided allegiance?
About 25 or 30 years after they entered the land of Canaan, Joshua was old. At this time, he's 110 years old. And he gathered all the tribes of Israel to Shechem for a special meeting. In chapter 19, in verse 49, we have the account of the division of the land for inheritance. And it's interesting to see how Joshua himself was so very generous to the people of Israel. For it said, when they had made an end of dividing the land for inheritance by their coast, the children of Israel gave an inheritance to Joshua, the son of Nun, among them, according to the word of the Lord. They gave him the city which he asked, even Timnath-Serah in Mount Ephraim. He built the city and dwelt there. So we see the character of Joshua right here. He proved himself unselfish by asking for his inheritance after all the other tribes had received theirs. As death approached, Joshua called for all the people and the leaders to come together for a final rehearsal of their journey from Egypt, as well as his final altar call for their consecration to the Lord. He was not giving them a choice of serving other gods here. He was just asking them to choose a total forsaking of these gods by staying faithful to Jehovah. He sought for them a confession of faith in Jehovah and reminded them of how God had blessed them and warned them of the consequences if they didn't repent and forsake their evil ways. His final summation is found in this very famous quote, "As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." He was a great man, a faithful man. He served God to the best of his ability. He had an awesome responsibility of leading just hundreds and hundreds of people into the promised land and settling them there in their new home. And so the answer to the question,
how does Joshua teach his people about a divided allegiance?
Joshua taught by personal example, especially when he said, "As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." Next Sunday's lesson will be entitled "The Dynasty of Kings Established." This figures into the eternal kingship of Jesus Christ, and we will go through 1 Samuel and 2 Chronicles to gather material on how Israel became a nation, finally settling on a king. God bless you. Have a great week.